Chapter 11. Resurrection. Cadbury eggs. Healing. More like scabbing, but getting there. Her back pressed against the sand as if her body was being pulled towards the center of the earth. She wanted to stay there and die, to allow the water to tuck under her empty vessel of a body and wrap around her like a shroud, and sink her under the earth, pull her out to sea to be devoured by some morbid beast, to finally be put to use. The tears came faster now and drenched her face. She imagined her tears forming around her and making a sea that would surpass the ocean behind her head. She'd feel like a god, proud of her creation. She'd look down on it and see the mystery man's beautiful face grinning up at her, waiting for her to make a move that she knew she never would. She sighed heavily and placed her arms over her eyes. Night was falling. The blood red of the sky was morphing into a faint pink, which in turn was turning into a bluish black. The air felt cold, like life was literally getting sucked out of her. Her breath made ghosts in the air and her arms were covered in goosebumps. Her chest felt tight and her mind alternated between hyperactive thoughts of the mystery man and numbness. She felt like she was being sucked into a whirlpool and there was nothing she could do about it. Sometimes the body can only take so much emotional trauma before it decides to pull the plug and digest what was given to it. And that's what happened to the girl. She slept for 3 nights to chew it all over. In that time, nothing seemed to be able to wake her, not the sun, the waves, nor the wind. On the 4th day, however, there was a change. The sky had tears streaming down its face, and those tears fell on top of her sleeping form. Tap, tap, tap. The world that was once rhythmically in tune to the point of being easy to ignore no longer was. There was a different beat, a different feel, and she awoke to these new sounds, to this new feel. Her body made sucking sounds as she detached herself from the matted sand her body had been lodged in. Everything cracked and popped as she stood, her body covered in sand and muck that felt heavy and was dried in some places, but that was watery and thick in others. The sky's tears weren't powerful enough to clean her, and she wasn't going to do it herself. There was another shift in the air that she, even in her detached state, couldn't help noticing. There were drums being played that sounded like a heartbeat coming from the trees on the island. The sound pulsed around her, coupling with the rain lightly tapping her as if to urge her towards the sound. She walked towards the trees, stiff, cold, and dirty. She wandered for a while, unable to find the source of the sound as it bounced off the trees. She started to panic, and her desperation urged her onward. She ran past trees, stumbled over rocks and ruts, and fell several times only to keep launching herself forward, headbutting the rain that was coming down harder now. With her head held down, she plunged thoughtlessly onward in what she believed was the direction of the drum's heartbeat. Her body pushed faster as her sluggish mind ignored the roots growing larger beneath her. Once they got too large to ignore, her head mechanically snapped up and she smacked directly into a large tree. Staggering in pain and disorientation, her body fell downwards, her eyes staring at the tears falling from the sky. Luckily for her, there was a steep hill, and down she went. The muck on her body weighted her down, and she was going too fast to stop herself from falling. Before she could reach the bottom, she tumbled over and around until she didn't know where the sky and the floor parted ways. They're the same, she thought wildly. They aren't separate, they're the same. She laughed in her pain as dirt and sand, mud and twigs impatiently vied for her attention and jumped into her mouth. Her hair nodded and snarled as she tumbled down. She dizzyingly recalled that someone had fell down a hill once and someone else had tumbled after. There's not going to be anyone tumbling after me. No one's coming after me, she thought wildly, and she cried with the sky until her back slammed into the ground at the foot of the hill, and all she could do was rasp in each breath and be hypersensitively aware of every ache and pull and electric misfire in her body. The drum heartbeat faded into the distance, and she saw the rain as an annoyance. It tapped on her face, just like the cruel poking of a child. Her tears returned, and she hurled them out with violence and rage, berating herself for following the sound in the first place. There seemed to be no point in it now that she was so broken. As the drum beats faded into nothingness, she could only hear herself. But the more she noticed herself, the angrier she became, which in turn increased her hatred. Her mind swirled, muddy and thick, fiery and savage, and she lay there until day became night, until she finally raged herself to an unsteady but deep sleep. As time went on, her eyes started to slit open. She saw a bloody but watery sky turning pink with the rising sun, and she felt swaying back and forth and forwards as if she was being carried. She noticed that she was moving towards the pink of the sky and leaving most of the watery red behind. She seemed to be in a burlap sack, and as her eyes opened wider, she saw several people carrying her in a makeshift stretcher that looked like a hammock. The rocking motion was lulling her to sleep, and she was too livid and stiff to want to do anything about any of it. They might be taking her to be cooked and eaten, or to toss her off a cliff, but she found she just didn't care. There's nothing to worry about when you have nothing left to lose. And so, for the second time, she slept. When she awoke, she kept her eyes closed. The air around her had become fragrant, and it filled her lungs with warmth and spices. Her nose twitched, unused to these foreign scents. Her body felt heavy and useless, though oddly alert, uptight, anxious, as if poised for danger. The rocking had stopped, and she was left stiff and still. There was a soft trickling in the distance, faint but steady. She shivered slightly, moved by a chill. She heard no voices or shuffling of feet, no breathing save her own shallow breaths, so she opened her eyes. She pulled herself to a seated position, her body aching, popping, and cracking. Her stiff neck turned slowly to take in that she was in some sort of teepee-like structure, filled with hanging dream catchers, curling herbal-scented smoke from a bundle of leaves, a blanket with an image of an angel on it, and a squishy table, which is what she was lying on. The blanket with the angel was lying on top of her, and she pulled it back and stood up. She looked at the ground and found the source of the trickling. There was a tiny brook running through and out of the teepee. One end of it headed out the flapping door. The other went out the back of the teepee. Its tarp was pulled up and pinned to allow the brook to flow without hindrance. On one hand, she thought that was kind of whoever thought of the idea, but at the same time, she thought it a little foolish to set up a teepee directly over a flowing brook in the first place. Her throat felt closed, hot, and scratchy. As the brook was flowing freely, she thought that it couldn't be too bad to drink, and so she fell heavily to her knees, cupped her hands, and drank from them quickly. The water tasted like dirt, but it was cold and better than nothing. As she reached out to grab some more, she noticed that her hands were still thickly encrusted in dried muck, so she leaned over the water to clean them, just as the swaying flap from the teepee opened. When she looked up, there was a woman standing before her. It must have been late morning or afternoon because the sun was strong enough to light up the teepee's opening behind the woman and to cover the woman and herself in light. The girl squinted against the light, and the woman closed the flap in response, letting it flow in the wind as it would. The woman stepped forward and reached out her hand. Numbly, the girl took it, and the woman helped the girl to her feet. The girl's breath hitched in her throat, and her heart beat a little faster, as if it just woke up and decided to join the show. She hadn't felt her heart beat in her chest ever since the mysterious stranger went away. She had thought it was broken forever, or just dead. The woman smiled and squeezed and patted the girl's hand. The girl thought that the woman must be either very brave or very stupid to take such a dirty hand in her own clean one. But the girl found herself smiling weakly back. The woman had a nice smile. The woman held onto the girl's hand for a bit longer and squeezed it gently, but firmly, and then released it. There was a short silence after that felt longer than it should have, as if time itself were holding its breath during the time when the woman just stared at the girl, examining her. It wasn't a typical female stare down, as in it wasn't filled with jealousy and venom. It wasn't a way to size the girl up to figure out her weaknesses so that a covert attack could be taken against her. Rather, it was more like curiosity. And at the end of it, it looked like it was filled with kindness, wisdom, and some deep understanding only known to herself. It was as if one woman's essence or soul had conversed with the other, even if unwittingly done, and the woman was satisfied with what she saw. But the girl was left wondering what good the woman could have possibly seen. The woman said her name was Althea, and that she was the shaman of her island community. The girl had heard of shamans before, but she wasn't exactly sure what that entailed. Her mind conjured up images of ghosts and black magic, dancing figures around fires who consumed human and animal sacrifices. She looked at the woman before her, didn't think that she looked like the type to dance around a fire in a hellish orgy, but the girl thought everyone holds darkness within themselves, and it's unlikely that this woman is an exception. But Althea's voice was soft and gentle, almost like a caress, but firmer. It had a weird sort of strength in it, which was confusing and unsettling. The girl mentally shook off her tangled feelings and asked Althea what being a shaman entailed. Althea smiled in response and took the blanket with the angel on it. She held it out with the angel facing the girl and said that a shaman is the link between the people and the universe, of all that is, was, and could be. Althea put down the blanket gently, smoothing it over with her hands, which rattled the girl with a tremendous chill that started from her head and flowed down her limbs with lightning quickness. Althea then pointed to the brook flowing through the tent and said that a shaman, in order to be that link, must be like that brook, a clear and reliable channel for positive energy to flow through. A shaman owes it to her people to be focused and trusting of the flow so she can give them strength and nourishment. But a shaman above all else is a healer of the people. The girl asked if that herbal scent was supposed to heal the people too. Althea told her that that scent is only one way to protect the people, and that it assists during healing by cleansing any negative influences in the areas that its smoke touches. The girl wrinkled her forehead involuntarily, finding it hard to believe that a smelly stick of leaves could protect anyone. The look wasn't lost on Althea, but she smiled anyway. Althea asked if the girl needed any healing. Althea looked so nakedly into the girl's eyes that the girl felt uncomfortable. The girl eventually shrugged slightly, not knowing what to say, and she looked shyly away. Althea smiled again and told the girl that she first needed a nice shower and some new clothes. There would be plenty of time for talking later. Althea called out for one of the villagers to take the girl to the shower. Althea told the villager to ensure that the girl would not be disturbed during her shower for any reason, and that she must bathe alone. Althea told the villager that the girl is not used to their ways, so her comfort level and views must be respected. Althea dismissed them both and said that she will find the girl after she is showered to continue their talk on healing. The villager then led the girl out of the tent and into the village grounds. The grounds were smaller and more intimate than she thought they would be. The teepees were next to each other, creating the feeling of being hugged or smothered, depending on your point of view. Smoke furled out from the top of each one and mingled together, dancing around and through each other in the sky. There wasn't much grass in between each teepee. There was mostly dirt, but as she followed the villager away from the huddle of teepees, the ground became more lush, the trees denser, the shade more intense, the air much cooler. The villager led her towards the sounds of rushing water. It was not like the ocean's music of rush and hush, back and forth. It was more like peeing, a rush of water lapping over rock and scurrying over the earth, rushing together towards a greater purpose, to get to that rush and hush that was so far away but that they knew was there. She and the villager ended up at a beautiful waterfall. The water flowed majestically down the rocks and showered down on the water below. The water was so clear that she could see straight to the bottom. On the one hand, the water was inviting. She could ease herself into it to finally be clean. Let the water run between her fingers, feel the sand under her feet, lean against a rock and just let the water run over her. On the other hand, it was uncomfortable, terrifying. It may be cold and could pierce her to the bone. It could clean her, it's true, but it couldn't do that on its own. She'd have to scrub herself raw, which would make her feel the cold even more. The water, too, would rub against and agitate her new burning stings. Worse yet, someone could see her naked. Sometimes it's just easier to be warm in the muck and unseen than clean and open to scrutiny. The villager handed her a washcloth and an unrefined block of handmade soap. Leaving some clean clothes lying on a rock near the bank, the villager walked away. When the villager was out of sight, the girl turned her head slowly, peering into the thick vegetation. She didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean someone wasn't there. Knowing there was nothing she could really do about it except hope no one was there, she let her head fall towards the ground and breathed in deeply. God, she smelled and needed a bath badly, but it'd be a lot of work, and she wasn't sure that she was up for the task. Her body just felt so heavy, and she felt so tired, so tired. The ground was more tempting than the water. She could lie there and sleep. Just let her body sink down into the muck. Just lay her head on her filthy, mud-caked arm and enjoy some beautiful, blissful sleep for as long as the villagers will keep away. It wouldn't take her long to sleep. It would take no time at all. The girl let herself sink to her knees, her fingers clutching the washcloth and soap. She barely registered what she was doing. Her body swayed in exhaustion, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them slowly and painfully, she noticed the form of someone she didn't expect. Not a girl, but a woman. Breathing heavily, she grabbed onto the mud at the water's edge and pulled herself closer to the water to see the woman's face more clearly. It was hard to tell what this woman looked like. She was just so covered in filth and muck. Only the outline of features could be seen, just a shimmery, shifting shadow and not much else. But her eyes were bright and doe-eyed, and they held both wisdom and sadness in a way the girl didn't understand. The girl swallowed hard and stood up, swaying a little. Clasping the handcloth and the soap like a prayer, she sighed and waded into the water. Her body went rigid and rejected the cold, but she persevered, wading and then swimming deeper into the water until she was right at the base of the waterfall, still clutching the washcloth and coarse soap. Though her body was submerged in the water, her head and neck were not, and she internally recoiled at the thought of that rush of frigid water. But she took a deep breath and flung her body forward under the waterfall to get it over with. The water smacked onto the top of her head and tumbled down her face and neck, ran its fingers through her hair and onto her shoulders. She turned her face upwards and let the water pull her hair from her eyes, allowing her body to shiver its way through the icy cold. She then rubbed the soap over the washcloth until it foamed and frothed over her hands. She placed the soap on the rocks near her and fiercely rubbed the cloth over her face, neck, shoulders, hands, and body. Her scrubbing chafed her skin, making everything feel sensitive, raw, and intense. Despite her scrubbing, there were still many parts of her that just refused to get clean. She scrubbed harder at those places, but the more she scrubbed, the more pain she was gifted in return. Her jaw clenched and she gritted her teeth against the pain, almost crying in her desperation to be rid of it, to finally be free. Over time, she was able to remove most of the dirt, but there was still some embedded in her hands. Rubbing off the majority didn't satisfy her. She wanted to be rid of it all, but she was in so much pain and she was so frustrated. She just left what was stuck and allowed the water to run over her, washing away the rest of the soap and scum, leaving her feeling thin, fragile, and weak. She grabbed the soap off the rock. After all that scrubbing, there was only a small stub left. But it wasn't her stub, and she was going to give it back, even if it was useless to do so. The washcloth was already in her hand, so she made her way to where clean clothes were waiting for her. She lifted herself onto the shore. The villager from before had not left her anything to dry herself with, making her vaguely wonder if the villagers just forgot to bring something for her, or if the villagers dried themselves in a different way. Shaking off that thought, she pulled her feet out of the water, reaching over to lie down the soap and washcloth near the clean clothes. Dangling her hands in the water to rinse off the excess soap, she saw the woman again, but the girl looked away quickly. Her heart fluttered in her chest and her palms felt warm despite the cold. She pulled her hands out of the water, closed her eyes, simply breathing in and out. As she took another deep breath, she opened her eyes to examine the woman in the water. The woman was not beautiful in the classic sense. She didn't have a soft, doughy moon pallor appearance. She was more harsh, more angular. However, she was nevertheless very feminine. Her protruding bones were rounded off gently by the skin along her jaw and cheekbones, effectively softening the angles and giving her an almost childlike appearance. Her skin resembled a dusky chestnut, and her dark hair was luxuriously thick, cascading down in gentle waves to her breasts. The girl noticed that the woman's hair turned a sunset red whenever the light hit it just right. The girl leaned over to see the rest of the woman more clearly. Her shoulders had strong bones jutting out as if they were defying the skin. The torso was straight and slender, and the breasts were small but perfectly proportioned. Her cheeks were blushed and her lips were small and pink. The girl leaned back from the water and contemplated the woman. She didn't seem like any average woman. She had an aura of mystery to her, which emanated prominently from the woman's eyes. The woman's eyes were deeply penetrating, as if they were a one-way mirror, one in which she could see right through into your soul, but you couldn't get remotely near to hers. The woman disconcerted her, and the girl slowly stood up. Rocks from the ground stuck to her legs. She shook them off impatiently, knowing they had left behind indentations like footprints in her skin. She let her hands glide through the water again before straightening up. She could see no other way to get dry than to air dry, but she felt exposed standing naked out there where anyone could wander by and see her. She glanced around her, hugging her arms tightly around her breasts and sides, partly to keep out the chill, and partly for protection. She knew if someone did show up, her covering her breasts alone was useless. A woman has more sides to protect than she has arms in which to cover them. She vaguely thought it odd that she wasn't embarrassed when she was bathing. Though, she countered, waiting can cause a body quite a bit of worry. Maybe there was a better way to get dry. The villagers must do it somehow, unless they just wantonly wander around the village in the buff, which, when she thought back on what Althea had said about her not being privy to their customs, made sense. Still, though, there has to be a better way than just waiting. So she set about doing the first thing that she always had done when an issue arose. She stood still and zeroed in to enter her own mind. She imagined different, though slightly unconventional, ways of getting dry. She could awkwardly rub herself with leaves and hope that none of them had bugs on them or that none of them were poisonous. She could rub herself with one of the clean clothes that were left and then wiggle that in the air to get it dry. But that seemed like a lot of extra work. By the time she decided on a course of action, she was partially dry. She finished it up by spinning around in a circle until she was dizzy. She paced back and forth and spun again when her head felt better. She was close enough to being dry to put on the clean clothes that the villager had left for her use. She walked over to where they lay and examined them before putting them on. The shirt was white and billowing, redolent of a pillowcase, and the pants were black and puffy with a low crotch. They were beautifully clean and soft, so she had no complaints. Althea had said that she would come to the girl after her shower, though how could Althea know when the girl was all set without having spied on her? The girl felt more self-conscious and wrapped her arms around herself, pulling on the loose-fitting white shirt for comfort. She walked a ways and discovered the same villager who had brought her to the waterfall standing sentry outside of the bathing place. Althea was speaking to the villager in soft murmurs, wearing a smile. Knowing that they were standing there the whole time made the girl a little nervous, and she looked back to check that they couldn't see the falls from here. They couldn't as far as she could see, but that doesn't mean they didn't peek. She shivered a bit in revulsion and faced forward. Althea's smile deepened as she saw the girl with the washcloth and dirty stub of soap still in her hands. Althea asked the villager to discard both items. The villager's face bore no emotion. She silently took the items from the girl and walked back towards the waterfall. Althea then wrapped her arm around the girl, and they walked away together. Althea asked how the girl felt now, and the girl replied that she felt much better. Althea grinned, stating that water is an amazing healer. It always seems to find a way to carry someone's burden away, to make her feel much lighter than before. She led the girl to the tent where they had first been, and she beckoned for the girl to lay down on the table. Confused, but willing to allow her tired body some rest, the girl did so. But her muscles refused to loosen, and her back started to ache. To get her mind away from her physical discomfort, the girl looked at Althea and noticed that she was holding the angel blanket that had been on the table prior to the girl's shower. Althea gently placed the blanket over the girl, smoothing her hands over the edges to tuck it in. As Althea moved and swayed, the girl felt a chill run through her stiffened spine, and she couldn't help but wonder if the beautiful man-god was walking over her grave. It certainly would be fitting. She will probably never see him again, at least not in this lifetime. The girl couldn't help her thoughts from wandering to him as Althea continued to gently smooth out the blanket and walk away to a table with her back to the girl. As Althea ruffled about, the girl tried to conjure up his beautiful face, but found to her devastation that she couldn't quite picture it. The other faces she had seen of the villagers, people she cared nothing for, as cruel, though true as that sounds, floated in her mind in place of his. Sometimes she just saw his outline with an infuriating blur of features. All that was clear to her was how his presence alone had made her feel beautiful. At least she had that to hold on to, though as she struggled to conjure up his elusive face, she grew frustrated and anger blossomed and burst in her chest. Her mind turned back to Althea to escape her hellish thoughts, though the anger was still sizzling inside her. Althea was holding rocks in her hands. She moved them around, and they clinked and rustled together with a pleasant chinking sound reminiscent of rolling dice. The girl wondered what could possibly be the purpose of a bunch of rocks, but Althea held them as if they were sacred. She placed several on the table on each side of the girl. A deep, shiny black rock that looked like it was made from various strips glued together was placed near the girl's right hip, while a dark red one was placed near her left hip. An orangey red rock was placed on one side of her lower stomach, while a candy corn colored one was placed on the other side. A more muted yellow stone was placed on the other side of her. Similar colored stones seemed to be placed on the same areas of her body. That is, until a very light pink stone was placed near her breast, and a mixed dark and light green stone was placed on her other side. She was confused why the pattern changed, but she said nothing, as Althea pressed on with the precision and concentration of a skilled surgeon. A dark blue and then a light blue stone were placed near her throat. A purple stone was placed near her forehead, as was a dark blue stone with some white patches on it. Another purple stone was placed near the top of her head, as was a very clear but rainbow-lighted stone. Althea made several trips to gather more rocks when needed. As she gently placed the rainbow clear stone down, Althea rubbed her hands together, making an oddly pleasant scratching sound. Then she headed over to the table to grab more items. This time, when Althea turned around, she held a small bowl with golden markings on it. A wooden handle of sorts was leaning inside the bowl. Althea held the bowl over various parts of the girl's body and tapped the wooden handle against the bowl's edge. The sound seemed to reverberate throughout the girl's entire body each time. After several rounds of this, including Althea hovering the vibrating bowl above the girl's limbs and around where the stones were placed, Althea put down the bowl and picked up what looked like a Native American version of a maraca. It was tan, with feathers, beads hanged off it, and had neutral-colored pictures of flying animals painted on it. Althea shook it gently over the girl's body. Althea returned to the table and rooted around until she found another bowl. Only this time it seemed to be made from a thick, opaque glass, and it was larger than the first bowl. The wooden stick that came with this bowl had a rubber ball at one end. Althea performed the same ritual, if ritual it was, over the girl as Althea had previously done with the smaller metal bowl. Though the sound this glass bowl made was a bit different, and the ringing was a bit scratchier than the first. Once done, Althea put down all objects and breathed in deeply. She stood beside the girl with her head slightly bowed and her hands pressed together as if she was praying. After a brief pause, Althea unfolded her hands and hovered them over the girl's body, gliding them along very slowly, as if they were tasting the air. Althea had her eyes closed, her brows furrowed as if with concern, particularly when her hands tasted the air around the girl's throat and over the area above the girl's belly button. Althea also seemed to stop and consider the air lingering over the girl's right leg, though this time Althea seemed equal parts concerned and puzzled. After she finished taste testing the air, Althea placed her hands atop the girl's head. The girl was appalled. When Althea had produced and utilized object after object, the girl felt vaguely numb. She just watched Althea perform those rituals and rites without really registering what was happening. Everything just seemed disconnected from her, as if everything was happening at a great distance. However, as Althea's hands were placed on her head, the girl started to register their weightiness, and the disconnection dissolved, immediately miring the girl in the present. The sensation somehow felt unbearable, making the girl want to squirm and move, to escape. But the girl forced herself to remain still, so still in fact that her back ached. She was unconsciously hovering her body above the table, as if she didn't trust the table to bear her weight. She kept expecting Althea to remove her hands, but Althea didn't. If anything, as Althea breathed in and out, the pressure of her hands on the girl's head increased, and the girl felt a rush of cold wind. It felt as if that wind was wedging her head open, cleaving it in two. It was a terrifying sensation, but oddly comforting, as if a great pressure was being released from her. As the wind increased, the girl feared that when the gap closed, a crucial piece of herself would be missing. As time went on, the pressure on her head seemed to ease, and she felt as if she was rocking backwards and forwards like a wave, moving to the rhythm of Althea's breathing. Despite the ocean being terrifying, the movement gave the girl a sense of calm and togetherness. It was as if she and Althea were one. Althea lifted her hands delicately from the girl's head, leaving a coldness behind. Her hands then landed on the girl's forehead around her eyebrows. The girl felt some warmth in the firm pressure of Althea's hands, but little else. Althea spent a short time at the girl's forehead before moving on to the girl's throat. She tented her hands in a pyramid shape, opting to cup the girl's throat rather than hold it. Her hands stayed around the girl's throat for a long time. Swallowing became difficult. The girl's throat pulsed against Althea's hands as if there was something in there, either trying to tear out of her throat or fighting to stay there. It felt as if the girl was wrestling with a demon. The girl's body shifted slightly in protest. She fought the urge to flee by tightening up her muscles and locking her body into place. Her breathing became shallower. Her throat continued to throb and pulse, and she couldn't help but fear that she was going to choke on her own spit. There was one last push-up from the demon within her, and her throat felt popped open, as if she just finished giving birth and was finally allowed some respite. Her breathing instantly became easier, and she felt as if there was a breeze issuing up out of her throat. It was more open than it had ever been in her entire life. She smiled in amazement that she could have survived this long without knowing that this degree of comfort and ease was possible. It almost made her nervous, thinking that her throat might close up again the second Althea's hands moved away. But no. Althea lingered for a bit more in her tented state, and then her hands moved in a T-shaped formation over the girl's chest, with one hand placed horizontally on the girl's upper chest, and the other placed vertically along the girl's breastbone over her heart. The girl was still able to breathe comfortably, and her body relaxed slightly against the table in response. The girl felt heat spread from Althea's hands into her chest. Althea's hands remained very still, only imperceptibly pressing down harder as time went on. But right before Althea lifted her hands to move on, the girl felt her body and Althea's hands moving forward and backward together again, as if they were waves on the ocean. It felt as if their breathing was in sync. Again, the girl felt comforted, and she even almost smiled. Althea lifted her hands and pressed them down firmly above the girl's belly button. Althea lingered there much longer than for the previous areas. The girl felt one of Althea's hands lift up. Althea waved her hands as if drawing an imaginary shape in the air. With a final flick, Althea lowered her hand again to the girl's abdomen. The girl didn't feel any change in particular based on those movements, but Althea's hand pressure steadily increased and comforting heat emanated from Althea's palm to the girl's cold abdomen. After some moments of stillness, Althea's hands moved downward to the area below the girl's belly button. The girl always associated this area with her period pains. Whenever the aching from the blessings of womanhood came around, she would rub that area, urging it to get warm so that her body could open up and finish dumping out what it shouldn't have bothered making in the first place. Oddly enough, instead of feeling heat or a waving togetherness, she felt a cool breeze rushing from Althea's hands into her body. The wind, though cool, didn't make her feel cold. It didn't even make her body ache. But she luckily wasn't cursed with the woman's blessing at that time. After puzzling over that sensation, she felt Althea move downwards. The girl stiffened, unsure of where Althea's hands would rest next. But to her relief, Althea's hands went one on each of the girl's hips, palms downward. The girl's body started to relax a little more, but that relaxation ended very quickly when her legs started to jump uncontrollably up and down. The movements were slight, with some jerky exceptions, but they were enough to make her a little concerned, fearful that she was developing muscle spasms that would last for life. Her worry lessened until Althea moved down to the girl's upper thighs. The jumping in the girl's legs ceased, and she let herself relax a little more. Althea stayed with her hands on the girl's thighs for a bit of time before moving on to the girl's lower legs, and then eventually to her feet. The girl felt a little self-conscious with her feet, but Althea seemed unconcerned with whether the girl's feet were clean or smelled okay. Althea held each foot between her hands and closed her eyes. Her breaths were even and deep, her exhales almost like sighs. Althea seemed to be finishing up. She traced some more imaginary images over the girl's body. Then Althea moved up to the girl's head and seemed to drag the air above the girl's body down towards her feet. Althea flicked the remaining air away from the girl's body. Althea did that 3 times and then placed her hands on the girl's shoulders. Althea told the girl to rest for as long as she liked. Althea said that she'd leave for now and will return to see how the girl's doing, but there's no rush to get up. Althea left the tent, and the girl saw that she was completely alone. For the first time, she allowed her eyes to shut and her mind to drift and chew over what she had felt and seen. It was different, that's for sure. Her mind reviewed what had happened and attempted to reach a conclusion about how she felt about it all. The choking sensation certainly wasn't pleasant, but the resulting breath release was well worth it. She breathed in deeply and smiled over how easily she swallowed. She didn't know if it was voodoo or not, but it worked, so she tried not to be too picky. Then there was the cold air that seemingly came from nowhere. That one confused her, but the heat that came from Althea's hands was nice. The weird backward-forward waving that felt like she and Althea were joined was oddly intimate in a mother-daughter kind of way, as if Althea was rocking the girl to sleep. Conclusion? It was different, and she still didn't know how she felt about it. The days passed by, but oddly enough, they were mostly pleasant. Althea showed the girl many things, various forms of healing that dealt with energy fields, vibrational sounds, crystals, the earth, the elements, and the sky. Althea opened up new worlds and ways to look at the world that the girl had never thought possible. The girl could feel her mind shifting and expanding beyond what she had known, and at the same time she could feel her old thoughts about what's right, what's wrong, and how humans in the world function or dysfunction crumble away, leaving space for those new thoughts, ideas, and practices to take root. But as darkness is born from light, the bad came with the good. Althea called it a healing crisis, and she defined it as some pain or discomfort, influx of conflicting emotions, or even regression of past negative thought patterns and or behaviors that can occur when one is shifting one's consciousness, or when one is working with energy or any type of higher spiritual work. Althea said it was the way of many things, that circumstances must get worse before they get better. Like when one needs a fever to run its course before it can break and allow the person to heal. The girl experienced many violent regressions of her past mistakes, her past moods, and ill will towards herself and others. Whenever periods of lucidity came, she would become a harsh disciplinarian towards herself for having fallen back again. But still, she persisted. This new world was too good to let go of, even if she didn't feel worthy of it. Despite her many experiences demonstrating the magic of healing, the girl still couldn't bring herself to believe everything is true or effective until it was taken through many rigorous tests and proven reliable under numerous circumstances. Althea was a patient teacher despite the girl's doubts, and Althea allowed the healing modalities themselves to heal the girl from within. Over time, the girl plucked up the courage to wander the village and meet others who taught her even more modalities, and very often they strengthened what she had learned from Althea. Without even realizing it, the girl's thirst for knowledge and innocent search for truth led others to seek out her company. The village women would include the girl in experiencing village life. They enjoyed her reactions and thoughts on each custom. The custom that stuck out the most for the girl was one that she had discovered by chance. The girl had wandered by the bathing place. It had become almost an obsession with her to see the woman in the water, to watch her change and grow. Some days the woman looked wise and confident, other days radiant with life. Sometimes she was dull and languid, other days lost and dazed. Regardless of how the woman appeared, the girl enjoyed checking in on her to make sure the woman was still there. One day, the girl had knelt by the water to gaze at the woman, and she abruptly heard women's voices, laughing and chatting over each other. She stood up quickly, wiping the dirt from her knees, and went to flee, not wanting to share her secret with them. She just managed to scramble into the foliage before a group of 11 women walked into the bathing place. They were still laughing and loudly conversing as they each stripped off their clothes, letting them pool at their feet. The girl's face felt branded with a hot iron, but she found herself crouching beside a small tree, watching the women from a safe distance. The women were of various ages, but they were all incredibly beautiful. Their bodies were soft, and their skin folded like dough when they moved. Their breasts, regardless of size, were heavy and weighted, voluptuously free. Their mounts of Venus were filled with curling hair of various shades and thicknesses. Everything on them radiated comfort and warmth. The girl watched the water lap up and down the bodies of the women, feet, knees, legs, hips, stomach, breast, as each of the women eased themselves into the water. The younger ones just jumped in fully, their breasts lifting like parachutes on the way down. The older ones smiled or clucked at the exuberance of the young. It was difficult for the girl to rationalize why she felt her eyes glued to where their bodies disappeared beneath the ripples. But still, she refused to leave. Barely breathing, she watched as women bathed with the coarse soap, laughing and talking, seemingly unabashed or affected by anyone else's blatant nudity. When they were finished, they each stepped out and the girl's eyes widened, waiting for the mystery of how they dried themselves to be revealed. The girl held her breath as she watched the women spin in circles, arms raised, fingers and wrists rotating in the most stunning dance. Some waved their hips or slouched their bodies, flung the water out of their hair here, pirouetted and tiptoe there. They were magnificent. They were fluid as water, as light as air, and each woman seemed to move based on her own will. Yet somehow they were dancing to the same silent music. As the water slowly dried off the moving women, the younger women clasped hands and spun in a circle together, laughing and joking. When they broke off, the younger and the elder women put on the clothes they had left safely out of the water's reach. They headed back towards the village whence they had come. The girl sat on her heels for a bit, a little breathless herself. Her mind was turning over each of the images she had witnessed. The practical side of her said that them getting sweaty was just dirtying them all over again, which means that their bath was practically pointless. The secret side of her, the one that watched the woman in the water, thought they were the most beautiful, confident creatures she had ever seen. They didn't care that they were all vulnerable and naked, open for all to see and judge. They danced with their souls, drawn by music only known to them. It was strange, certainly, but splendid. The girl shook her head, unable to reconcile those two sides of herself. Her stiff legs lifted her body mechanically and slowly. Her feet took her towards the bathing pool, and the girl sank to her knees beside it, face staring down into the woman's. Breathing heavily, she turned to see if anyone was coming, straining her ears for any sign of the others. Satisfied that she was alone, she lifted her shirt over her head and placed it beside her. She stared down at the woman's breasts reflected in the pool. They were small but well formed, the nipples hard and thick. She gazed down at the rest of the woman's body, avoiding looking at the woman's face. The girl dipped her fingers into the cool water, raining droplets on her breasts. She rubbed the fresh water onto her warm skin. As the water dripped from the tip, she stood up and opened her arms and spun in an ungraceful circle for a few loops. Her arms dropped down as she stopped, her cheeks reddening at her own foolishness. The girl put on her shirt and walked slowly back towards the village. Over time, she would occasionally find herself drawn back to the bathing pool to admire the confident women. But she spent most of her time looking at the woman in the water, whose body she hadn't known existed. But the girl told no one about her experiences at the bathing pool. When in the village, the girl spent most of her time learning from others. Only when the girl didn't have lessons for the day did she realize how little time she spent with Althea now. The girl's heart ached, and she went to Althea's teepee for a visit. When the girl arrived, she got the sense that Althea somehow knew she was coming. After Althea had hugged the girl and welcomed her into the teepee, Althea told her that there would be a naming ceremony wherein the girl would pick a name for herself. The girl was choosing to be a better version of herself, which would enable her to step into the world as the beginning healer, so she would need a fresh identity to go along with that change. The girl was a little taken aback. She felt strong in her learning, but at the same time there were times when she noticed how little she did know, and how unstable the effects were. She didn't feel worthy of such an unexpected honor. Althea and the other villagers had been planning this ceremony for a long time, and as the girl knew only too well, part of growing means growing pains, so the girl accepted. The ceremony was set, to the girl's dismay, for dawn. In preparation, the girl was given an incredibly thick book filled with names. It was similar to a baby name book, except that each name was accompanied by a short explanation of someone powerful or famous who had that name, along with some photographs, drawings, and or paintings. Althea explained to the girl that she should look through the book at her own pace and select the name that speaks to her the most. The ceremony's short turnaround time was designed to discourage overthinking. The girl was puzzled and asked how she would know which spoke to her with so many options potentially speaking to her at once. And what if none spoke at all? Althea smiled and said the girl was more than ready to figure it out. And with that, she directed the girl to a teepee so that she could get to work. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor with the book in her lap, her head heavy, chin on chest, eyes squeezed shut, silently cursing Althea for offering no guidance whatsoever. The girl had looked through the pages of the book, reading every single name, and felt like her brain was bleeding. Halfway through, she closed the book and caved in on herself. Agape, Aileen, Electa, Alejandra, Elena, Alessandra, Andrea, Elisha. Her head was swirling so much it made her want to die. In desperation, she tried to push all her training to the surface, but failed. She opened her eyes and swept them quickly across the room to find something, anything, that she could use for help. Her eyes fell on 2 rough pieces of calcite. She scooped them up and squeezed them in her hands as her head anchored down again and her eyes squeezed shut. She tried to meditate and force her body to relax. The harder she tried, the more she failed. The more she failed, the harder she squeezed the stones. The harder she squeezed the stones, the more distorted her body and soul felt. The girl's mouth was clenched so tight that only a squeak of frustration was allowed to pass through as she bent over double and squeezed the stones until her knuckles blanched white. A few tears slipped out from under her eyelids and a choked cry escaped her thickened throat. She felt like she was choking. Sucking in some deep breaths, she drew out the exhales, focusing her attention on relaxing each part of her body, starting with her feet and working her way upwards. When she got to her hands, she gently laid the calcites by the sides of her hips and rubbed the tension out of her hands. Althea's lack of guidance kept popping back into the girl's mind, but she pushed that aside until she relaxed her head. Once that was done, her mind finally dredged out some of her training. Summoning up her rage against what she deemed to be unfair and cruel treatment for an alleged honor, she allowed her rage free rein within her while she kept her body still. As she let the monster loose, her body would occasionally shake. She fought the urge to fight it, and she let the rage pass through. Eventually, it finished its course, and she let herself breathe in and out slowly, with her exhale lasting longer and being more exaggerated than her inhales. Her body slumped down some more, and it felt like her body was asleep, but her mind was finally vibrantly awake and stunningly clear. She let out another long breath, slowly blinked her eyes awake, and opened up the book again. She allowed herself to breathe slowly in and out as she flipped through random pages, letting her eyes linger where they would. As she'd been taught, she allowed her inner guidance to lead the way. Anything that stuck out, she wrote down for herself, and with each name, she included a brief description of each connection and or meaning. The day was almost spent by the time she had 5 female names listed. She leaned back and allowed herself a small smile. 5 was a lot better than thousands. 1. Acheloise, she who washes away pain, moon goddess. 2. Hakata, worker from afar, goddess of magic. 3. Cassandra, helper of men, cursed prophetess. 4. Terpsichore, delight in dancing, goddess of dance. 5. Erato, goddess of lyrical love and erotic poetry. She breathed in and out again, willing herself to focus, relaxing her eyes as she did so. She glanced down at her list to see if she could bring herself to pick just one. Her eyes were naturally drawn to one and then another name. Every time she looked, it felt as if she was being pulled to a different name. Her mind was imploding with overthoughts. She breathed in and found herself holding her breath. She forced it out and returned to the list, looking at each name in turn. Since the name book had the collection of further information about each name, the girl found each of her narrowed down names and read each story and studied each picture, making very small written observations as she went to see if they could help her narrow down her search for for the perfect name, Achilles, beautiful and sensual, free. Achilles was one of the ancient Greek muses. She was a goddess of the moon and a famous healer. The Dodonian oracle often instructed mortals to offer sacrifices to Achilles so that she could rid them of disease. Her name is used as a general term for water nymphs, and her name in English means she who washes away pain. Healer with water, like the women at the watering hole. Hecata, more than one person in one. Hecata was a goddess of magic and spirits. She is associated with the number 3, often being represented as having 3 forms, including the maiden, the waxing moon, the mother, the full moon, and the crone, the waning moon. Her name means worker from afar. Though split, still magical. Cassandra, beautiful and open. Cassandra was a mortal Trojan princess who learned the gift of prophecy by the Greek god Apollo. He had taught her with the intention of having intimate relations with her. When she refused his advances, he cursed her with never being believed by others, despite her predictions always being true. Cassandra means helper of men. Strong in her morals, brave to rebel against a god, and strong, or stupid, to tell the truth even when it's futile because no one believes her. Terpsichore. Gorgeous movements, like the women at the watering hole. Terpsichore was one of the ancient Greek muses who inspired the arts. She ruled the art of dancing. She was the mother of the sirens, though she herself wasn't evil. Her name means delight in dancing. She's a dancer. Erato. Very sensual, confident, and uplifting. Erato is one of the ancient Greek muses. She rules erotic poetry and love poems. Her name means desired, beloved, or lovely. Not afraid to speak about physical truths, embraces sexuality. The girl looked over her notes, gingerly rereading them and the descriptions. She also reviewed the images to see if she could finally figure out which was the perfect name for her. She sighed in frustration. They were all so beautiful, so sensual and confident. They all didn't allow their beauty to dull their ambitions. How could she, so small and plain, measure up to these goddesses and heroes? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain her calm, mentally abusing herself for her pessimistic attitude. Useless. She couldn't decide on one name for sure. The girl sighed, her chest caving in with disappointment. Doubt swirled in her mind, and she found she couldn't stand to look at anything anymore. She was just too damn tired. She placed her lips to one side and went to search for sleep. But when she embraced it, it would slip away, leaving her waking up fitfully throughout the night. Each time she awakened, she thought about how she just didn't know what name would encapsulate all that she had learned and still wanted to. What name could she possibly choose that would reflect her true self when she was still discovering who that is? The girl squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't proud of herself, but the more she awakened, the more anxious she grew. The more anxious she grew, the more all the lessons she had learned were pushed aside to make way for the anchor that had supported her throughout her time on the island. The man god. She thought of him infrequently, but whenever she was anxious or needed support, he was always foremost in her mind. As she couldn't sleep and she was so anxious her stomach hurt, she mentally summoned him, her insides slightly twisting in regret, though her heart felt lighter than it had for hours. She didn't bother mentally telling him her troubles. She just spent time resting in his arms until sleep came like a thief in the night and stole her away. Despite how much the girl set her will against it, she couldn't stop the new day from arriving. It rose in a light gray, with fringes of black, as if the day, too, was half asleep. Or maybe it didn't want to see the girl named either. You and me both, she thought, as she groaned her way up to a sitting position. Her whole soul still felt curled up in bed. Her body moved, mechanically dressing itself. Her heart was throbbing shallowly in her chest and beating irregularly, making her feel like she was going to die at any moment. She took care to force herself to breathe in fully, though her ribcage turned into a corset and seemed dead set against expansion. Once dressed, she slowly ate a very light breakfast, but she couldn't prolong the moment any longer. It was dawn, and the ceremony was starting soon. This was really happening. She walked out of the teepee into the faint light. The villagers were gathered around in a semicircle with Althea near the top of the opening, like a star in a crescent moon. The girl walked laboriously, as if she was wading through molasses. The weight of many eyes felt burdensome and pushed on her already tight chest, as she slowly made her way to stand by Althea. Althea put her arm around the girl, and the warmth made the girl's chest loosen a little. We are here to witness this momentous and beautiful moment in this young woman's life, where she will choose her own name, her own path, her own destiny. She will decide what name each tongue will speak when addressing her from this day forward. At this, Althea gave the girl a gentle push, and as the girl looked at all the faces around her, some smiling, some impatient, some bored, some daydreaming, some curious, some even angry, she couldn't help but feel like throwing up. She swallowed thickly and took one shaking step forward, deeper into the moon with her head down. For a long while the girl remained silent. The sun clawed up higher in the sky, the air became warm and close, and still she did not speak. Althea stepped forward and extended her hand to touch the girl, but the girl gave a great sigh and Althea retreated. The 5 alternatives swirled in the girl's head. She breathed in and out and allowed her body to still so that her mind could follow. Her eyes glazed over and she barely noticed the others around her, awaiting her answer. Head down, eyes closed, she breathed in and out, seeing in her mind's eye the 5 names, the descriptions, her notes, and the images. Achilles, Hecata, Cassandra, Terpsichore, Erato. Achilles, Hecata, Cassandra, Terpsichore, Erato. She felt the in-breath and heard the out-breath. In, out, in, out. Achilles, Hecata, Cassandra, Terpsichore, Erato. Achilles, Hecata, Cassandra, Terpsichore, Erato. All powerful women, all goddesses, except one. The girl opened her eyes and looked up. She gazed at everyone around in the crescent moon, even turning to the star that is Althea. With her face turned towards the sky to the rising sun, the girl's mouth curved into a small smile. Cassandra, she said. My name is Cassandra. As the ceremony drew to a close, a group of women walked to the waterfall to bathe together. A tiny ball formed in her stomach as Cassandra watched them go. She shuffled her feet in the dirt, breathed in and out. Then she followed them. Cassandra jogged to keep up and entered their circle from behind. The women clapped her on the back and congratulated her for her name choice. They invited her to join them, and she agreed. As the other women pulled off their clothes and dived or eased themselves into the cool pool, Cassandra held back. She took her clothes off slowly and carefully, but she hesitated on taking off her bottoms. She breathed in and out again and pulled them off without thought and walked towards the water's edge. The other women's voices cut off, and the silence felt like it breathed. They eyed the thick scar rising like a small mountain from the smoothness around Cassandra's stomach and right above her pubic bone. And a few of the women could even make out the small white scar across Cassandra's heart. She expected to feel shame at their gazes, but Cassandra oddly felt strong. She had been through hell, but she came back. The scars were her passports to return. She smiled and cannonballed into the water, splashing the others with her wave. The others broke into laughter, and together they worked on getting themselves clean. A few asked how those scars were made, and how old she was when they happened. Cassandra told them that she'll tell them about it someday. She showed her scars today, which was already a giant leap, but true confidences take time. A few accepted that answer with knowing nods, though the many just saw the scars and tried their best to ignore their existence. After everyone was clean and well wrinkled, they stepped out of the water, the women commencing their dances to get dry. Their dances were even wilder because of all the spirits they had consumed at the ceremony. She stood and watched them, smiling at their wild gestures. Their swinging hair baptized her with water, christening her Cassandra, the one who defied a god for the sake of dignity and humanity, the one who couldn't remain silent about the truth no matter how many hearts failed to understand it. She looked down on the water at the scarred and beautiful woman Cassandra, and she couldn't stop herself from smiling as she opened her arms and spun, ducked, jumped, and danced without inhibitions, without restraint, daring to be free.